By now, you've probably seen a number of posts about YouTube demonetizing inauthentic content. From a certain point of view, it seems like a sort of monkey's paws granting of a wish. There was an era where there was some agreement with the platform that making more content is part of the job. This was used to defend a lot of bad stuff. I tread carefully here because there's an increasing amount of cynicism, which I'll get to in a minute. Then they built a machine that makes content. In theory, this would exonerate honest efforts and make them more valuable, and dishonest efforts like misinformation less valuable. Instead, everything is just as bad. People demand to feel something from what they watch, but they're not open to feeling anything but outrage. Then this outrage is directed at the creators rather than having some introspection. They can watch a cute cartoon and only think about how it should be so much more. At some point, if you can't warm your cold dead heart, that's on you, and not everything is going to appeal to everyone. But of course, like so many things, it's an organized, disorganized push to do something about it. Do what exactly? Who knows? But something must be done, and it's everyone's duty to rally behind the cause. While there's certainly things that would benefit from collective action, so much of social media is saturated with chaotic calls to action. The call for authenticity incites another crackdown. Just like the call for moderating inappropriate content got us restrictive yet inconsistent rules, the platform is focused on authenticity, and also in the background seems to assume everything is meant to be educational, and takes issue with things not having educational value, though that's sort of a separate thing. It also doesn't help that the platform and its owner have a vested interest in protecting their fool's golden goose. So that puts them in a weird spot. Advertise features that, by their own rules and the precedent set by previous judgments, should get a channel demonetized, and then spend all their time playing whack-a-mole, seemingly striking channels at random. Given how much trust is given to machine learning, it wouldn't be surprised if there was randomness or bias that isn't quite in line with what either the site wants nor the public sentiment wants. But either don't care or it would be too complicated to improve. For example, OpenAI had several versions of their ChatGPT be afflicted with excessively mentioning creatures, and this occurred due to a training issue where they inadvertently incentivized mentioning creatures because some tests showed it favorable, and since the flawed incentives were discovered partway through training, it'll be a whole training cycle before they're able to fix it. The stakes are arguably even higher. While this moderation tool isn't an LLM or isn't just an LLM, if it fails, then there's a lot of money and incentive to produce content that exits the site. From the outside, you could say, well, that's good. They're not wasting money on inauthenticity, so real true creators can get more. But some of the ones hit, I'd argue, aren't inauthentic. It's not an all or nothing. Sure, there's always going to be some that say, but I didn't do anything, when arguably they did. But it can still be a problem. Authenticity and sometimes sincerity gets thrown around a lot when talking about media, and since indie animation is big now, a lot of this discourse is had about indie animation. Just like the terms, indie animation itself seems to be poorly defined. In its most direct definition, it's animation from anyone not owned by the big N film production companies. But some argue that some things are too small to be indie, that this is a term reserved for real serious studios with large amount of funding that just happen to be independent of larger production studios. So anything that doesn't qualify for that flies under the radar or is worse considered not valuable or worth talking about at all. In some sense, that should be relief, a shelter from the discourse and expectations. On the other hand, though, sometimes it's presented as though these smaller projects are something that's cluttering the space. Something that needs to be blocked and cleared out to make room for more worthy entities to showcase their shows. And then there's the other side of the line, that some things are too large to be considered indie. At some undefined level, a studio crosses over from being a beloved underdog into being Hollywood elites, whose skeleton closets are now finally ready to be opened and examined. YouTube, despite being built for recommended stuff, doesn't do a good job at surfacing animation. Supposedly, there's loads and loads of animation out there to the extreme that discussion about it leaks out into areas that I can see. While everyone's experience with the algorithm is probably different, it's strange belief that there's so much that it's a real chore to watch stuff on YouTube. It's like when people talk as though big cinema is dragging them to the theater every day and forcing them to watch movies they've already decided they don't want to watch. Except if the cinema was in a random unmarked building and you had to know where to look, much less suffer through whatever they're showing that week. So I guess it's really hard to comment on the specifics because even when I want to, I don't see it. It's kind of a funny complaint. I'm basically saying, let me in so I can see it and be just as disappointed as the rest of you. So it kind of just seems like people want proof that others are trying their best so they can turn around and say, well, your best is not enough. And no, that's not okay. Something must be done about that. I do know it's an era where many have openly said they don't care if it takes effort, if the result isn't groundbreaking. Being unique and mind-blowing in an era when everyone's seen everything seems like an impossible task. And if anything, trying to be different just means being less authentic. You have to authentically have a perspective that is both completely different from anything out there, yet also very appealing. It can't be different and unappealing or else it's just somehow fair game. To overlook the themes or get angry because it doesn't make sense. If you ask hundreds of thousands of people to write you something, chances are they're going to write something they can relate to. While there are cultural differences, there's a lot that has been the same. It isn't that in the last 20 years creativity evaporated. The last 30, 40, 50 plus years are full of stuff that have been written about far longer than that. Romance, betrayal, war, etc. comedy is insincere because it can only ever be an excuse to cover up being bad at writing. It could never be that someone sincerely finds it something funny and wants to share it. Might not be that funny to you, but that's a pretty big accusation to assume it's some kind of malice. Some kind of insidious plot that you've discovered. Another thing that makes me question these complaints are when they are things I do know about. I've seen the phenomenon of what if cute thing turns out to have a dark secret?
How original.
I've considered commenting on it myself. Mostly in regards to games though. Games that are just wholesome are considered to be lacking substance. Similar thing to demanding movies be dark in order to be realistic, as if realism is the most important thing in films. One can't stand a film being true to the real world as though there's something inherently wrong with dreaming about things being better. It's like the war on misinformation has been reduced to a small set of values that fit neatly in with cynicism. The world is bad, therefore a film claiming things could be better through extraordinary character, circumstances, and effort must be a trick to hide how bad the world is and should be refuted as such. So when someone says, well, the problem is everything is too edgy and it wants to be too mature, why isn't there more lighthearted stuff? The answer is, 1. There probably is, but you would hate that too. 2. Different genres and styles exist. It doesn't make sense to say, well, there's a lot of X in indie animation, so it all has to go away in order for the thing I want to exist. 3. Being mature is not inherently the opposite of being sincere. You can have an authentic view of something in the world and have that view be something mature. To assume that because that's a specific pattern, that everything remotely similar must be crammed into that pattern, is a level of cynicism and reductiveness that doesn't actually help fix anything. And sometimes the complaint is the opposite. Too much nostalgia, inability to grow up and focus on mature topics. So what you want is a mature, realistic take on taboo subjects to counter naive and regressive whimsy, but you also want it to be whimsical and unburdened by trying too hard to be mature. There's some shows that have moments of both, which may clash, but if you want the entire series to fit in a neat box on either extreme, you will never be satisfied because that doesn't allow for it to have enough span of nuance to ever do both. It seems like whatever general malaise there is in regards to corporate entertainment is being seen in two different and conflicting ways. I'm being presented with extreme and exclusive statements that Hollywood and the average viewer are cripplingly incapable of watching or making anything uncomfortable and are stuck watching things that are aggressive. At the same time, albeit tries too hard to be edgy, and there's no more wholesome stuff. And somehow, that is my problem, and something I have to reconcile and do something about, even though it makes no sense. Then the complaints turn towards the amazing digital circus. Yes, the circus is set in a bright, whimsical circus, but the notion of there being something sinister about it is introduced very, very quickly. There is no effort to deceive the viewer in that regard. Immediately after the theme song, we're confronted with the horror of the idea of being trapped in a strange realm forever, not being able to do things like remembering your name. The more subtle bits, like hints of backstories, archetypes of people that mirror the kind you might see in the real world, add a lot to it, and are worth taking note of. It's mature because it isn't glossing over the issues of trauma, but overall it's not just throwing them in as a punchline or for shock value. You can have a comedic take on a subject without treating the subject as though it's simple or not as serious. It really doesn't feel like a cheap, trendy trick as much as using those elements in a more focused and meta way. Is it perfect? Nothing's perfect, but it does come off a little odd to me when the notion of an epidemic of insincerity is backed by things like claiming this show is like all the others trying to cash in on being unsubtly secretly creepy. It just makes me wonder how much this problem actually exists and how much stuff out there might actually be good but isn't as discoverable or popular yet serves to perpetuate the idea that the genre, not really a genre, is inherently doomed to be insincere and driven by creators that are just trying to cash in on trends. This is, of course, alongside other fatal flaws, deadly sins, and so on, in the form of complaints like the dialogue is bad. You've got layers of nets. Something passes one test, it will fail another. And then you can sit back and say, there's nothing to watch. Or, see, none of this can be good. Which raises a question. If Hollywood is inherently bad and indie is inherently bad for not being like Hollywood, what do you actually want? What is it that you want creators to make you beyond a vague, make it good? This is a lot of interconnected problems and complaints, some of which have tangents and phenomena of their own. Some of these exist separately, but for the purposes of the video, focus on where they intersect with authenticity, in particular the complaint that nothing is authentic anymore.